Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming, everybody. This is the Angular MTV meetup, Mountain View meetup. So we'll start with announcements. There aren't really many announcements today. The only one I've got for you is that Jeremy did release a brand new alpha of Angular Material 2. So if you're using Material 2, check that out. It's called Mithril Hoverboard for some reason. Okay, so Mithril Hoverboard of alpha of Angular Material came out today. It's Material 2. Try that out. There's a new directive in there. Don't remember what it's called, but check it out. There's some new features, a bunch of bug fixes, according to Jeremy. 2.2 of Angular will be out tomorrow, so that'll be awesome. A bunch of bug fixes in that. Any new features you know of in that, Matthias? No breaking changes from the peanut gallery. So yes, no breaking changes. So today, normally there were a couple other speakers scheduled. Stephen had to go to Belgium. Kara was busy, so you're all stuck with me for the duration. What I was going to do today, I spent a lot of time talking to developers on Gitter and on IRC and like every communication channel we have, and I get a lot of tweets and a lot of questions. And so what I wanted to do today is kind of go over just some of the sort of basic questions, or not so basic, but I guess more advanced questions that I get about Angular 2. Like, how do I do things that we don't really cover in the documentation? How do I do more advanced composition of views? How do you do all this kind of stuff that you used to be able to do in Angular 1 that you may not know how to do in Angular 2? Does that sound good to everybody? Yeah, people are nodding their heads like that's good. So cool. So the first one is always this, right? Dynamic components. How do I do dynamic components? Where is my $ compile gone, right? This is the thing that everybody misses when they come to Angular 2 for the first time. We have a really powerful system for this. But to be honest with you, it's not super well documented yet. That's something that we're working on at the moment. But I think it's really something that when you see it kind of happen and you see kind of how these pieces fit together, it'll explain to you not only how to do dynamic components, but also hopefully a little bit more on why we have things like ng modules and why we made this big change for you, because it really makes highly dynamic stuff actually really nice and easy to do and really powerful. I want to cover this today because we were talking to a company earlier this week, and they showed me just an amazing, like, entirely data-driven dashboard, the kind of thing that you've all done in Angular 1, right, where they have metadata coming off the server, and they construct these super dynamic dashboards with streaming stuff. It was really amazing. And it's the kind of thing that I want everybody to be able to do. So that's what we're going to start with today, just get a feel for kind of how you assemble these views together. Cool. So I've got a really simple, basic app. This is just the Angular Quick Start app. You can clone it from GitHub if you want to play with it, and I'll go ahead and post this at the end of the talk as well. So let's open up a browser here. This is the right port. It's not the right port. Sorry. All right. So this is not my first Angular app, but we'll act like it is, maybe. Cool. So you've all seen ng modules before, and I just want to talk a little bit about what these things mean, because it informs kind of how we are going to do some dynamic component insertion today. So there are really two ways that you refer to components in Angular, right? So when you're writing templates, you use the selector, which you assign when you're building components, right? So if I was going to use this my app component, I would use the my app selector somewhere in a template, right? And then Angular's compiler picks it up and it says, okay, I know what this thing is. I'm going to go ahead and create a new component and stick it in this space in the view, right? So you've all done this. This is Angular 2 101, basically. But where it gets interesting, right, is if you consider, what if you're using the router, for example? And the router is actually a really good case of dynamic component loading, right? Like, you don't at any point inside when you're using the router, you never say my-route as a component, right? You never refer to a routable component by its selector. You refer to it by its class, right? And so the important thing to note here is that we're generally going to use this when we're talking about dynamic component insertion. I'm going to say composition like 12 more times today, so sorry about that. So the key here, the first thing I want you to kind of lock into your brain, right, is that when I'm doing dynamic component insertion, I will be referring to this thing by its class, okay? The second thing to know is when Angular does all of its magical stuff, when we talk about the compiler and ahead of time compilation and all of that, right? The job of Angular's compiler is to take components and templates and wire them all together, right? And so under the hood, what happens is Angular takes this component and it turns into what's called a component factory. So a component factory, if you like, is just the compiled version of an Angular component, right? So that, again, that's gone and fetched the template. It's taken all the template instructions and turned them into rendering instructions. It's wired up all your dependencies, all that stuff. You get this component factory that allows you to instantiate a new component. So components are what we start with. Component factories are what we want. Component factories are the things that you insert into the view. That's the sort of low-level API that you need to get to. And so one of the things, who here is using Angular 2, I guess is the first question. A bunch of you, good, some of you, cool. First thing is, if you've been following along for a while, you probably have never seen this term component factory. It's not something that we surface anywhere. It's something that really, it's always been there, but it's always been under the hood in Angular 2. It's not something that you ever really touch directly. But it's not a scary thing, and it's super powerful. And I kind of want to just give you a feel for how this works. So we made this big change right before we released, and we added ng modules, right? And so really, ng modules are kind of added to Angular for a number of reasons, but this dynamic component case is something that this was really, for me, was the big driver as to why we went with ng modules. And so the thing to understand, right, is that if we want to do something like dynamic component compilation, right? So I have a view, and then I want to grab like a modal dialog or a confirmation component or anything like that you're going to dynamically insert into the view. I need to turn this thing into a component factory, right? So I need to take my component, I need to compile it. And so if you were doing this at the beginning of Angular 2, you probably used something like the dynamic component loader or used the compiler directly. And the problem we ran into, the problem we found quite quickly, is that we had this problem where you as a developer would write some service, some method, some component that took another component, and you'd end up having to do all this compilation work yourself, right? So at some point, you'd go and grab our compiler, you'd take your component, you'd run it through the compiler, and you'd get this component factory out of it. The problem with that is that when we want to do this ahead of time compilation, right? So this is the idea where we're going to do all this compilation work ahead of time. At build time, we're going to generate these component factories on disk for you. It means that you get in a situation where in one case, you're referring to the component, right? And then in the other case, you're referring to the component factory that's already been compiled, because we've already done that on the server. So you get in this place where your code doesn't match depending on the mode that you're in, right? And so right now, AOT compilation is a little slower than we'd like it to be. So most people are running JIT compilation when they're doing dev, right? And then AOT compilation is something that they sort of switch on to go to production. And that's absolutely the right way to do it right now, I think. But the problem comes if you don't have some method for dealing with this, you end up having to rewrite your code to switch modes, which is really what we wanted to avoid. So the thing that we added, and this will hopefully immediately make sense to you. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add like export class my dynamic, hopefully I could spell dynamic components. Just call it comp, it's easier. I'm going to go ahead and add our component decorator to it. And it doesn't really matter what I call this, because we're not going to use that selector. And we're just going to say in here div hello world. Sorry, everybody. Just watch me stumble through what I'm doing here. I promise that I'm an actual developer sometimes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my app module here. I'm going to go and import that component I just created. And so I'm going to add it to declarations. And again, if you're using Angular 2, you've done this a bunch of times. So this tells Angular's compiler about this component, right? This is something that I can use. But I'm also going to add it to this entry components array. And so this entry components array is interesting because the point of this is the box you need when you want to refer to something by its class, right? And so the general theory here is going to be, I want to tell Angular, this is a component that I want to dynamically insert into the view. And it's Angular's job to do the compilation of that component, right? Like I shouldn't have to worry too much about how it gets compiled or when it gets compiled or anything like that. I'm just going to tell Angular, I want to use this dynamic component as an entry component, something I'm going to refer to by its class. So that's the first part of this, right? And hopefully we're not going to see any errors in the console. Hopefully, if I click through this, my app is actually still running. It is wonderful. It's always a good start. And so all this says to Angular is, I'm going to use this thing by its class, and I want you to go ahead and compile it for me into an entry component or into a component factory. And then it's also going to generate for me a mapping between the component and its component factory. So all this tells Angular is, hey, at some point, I'm going to refer to this thing by its class. So if I go back into my app component here, I'm going to import probably the worst named thing in Angular, to be honest with you, the component factory resolver. And the components factory resolver is, as it says on the name, right? Its job is to resolve component factories. So again, we're going to give this thing a component. I know, right? Amazing. We're going to take this thing and we're going to say, here's a component. Give me back, resolve its factory for me. Let's see if that's big enough for everybody. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and inject this thing. Just shorten that to CFR, component factory resolver. And then I can say to the component factory resolver, resolve me a component factory. Right? Component factory resolver, resolve component factory. I'm going to switch the order of these just so that we are not going to run into scoping issues here. So what I'm going to say is, dear component factory resolver, resolve for me a component factory. And what this should return to me is basically my dynamic component factory. Component factory. All right, so all I've done here is ask this magical thing inside of Angular. I've told you I want you to compile this thing into a component factory for me. And now I have a way to reference it. So at this point, what I get back is a component. That's not even close. We'll just call it my factory. So this is now a component factory. And it's a component factory of type my dynamic component. And then this my factory is now something that I can actually do creation with, right? This has all the information needed to actually jam this thing into a view somewhere. That's part one. That makes sense to anybody? Any sort of immediate questions to jump out at all here? So the key takeaway from this, right, is that at this point, you don't have to worry about Angular's compilation at all. You're not going to inject the compiler. You're not going to dynamically, lazy load components, anything like that. Your job is just to tell Angular, I want you to compile this into a component factory. It's Angular's job to do that, whether we're running this in JIT mode or AOT mode, right? And this is the magical bit here, is that it doesn't matter now when you're doing your compilation, whether that's upfront or ahead of time, on your build server. So this is the first part. The second part is that we need somewhere to put this, right? We need to actually tell Angular, okay, I've got a component factory and I want to insert it into the view, right? Somewhere in this template, I'm going to stick this thing in. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. The simplest one, I'll just cover the simplest one to start, is to basically just get a reference to some part of the view, right? Some part of the template that exists now, just get a hold of it and be able to say, I want you to stick your component into this thing here, right? So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to create a template in here. Using a template is nice because it's not actually going to take up any space, right? This is just a marker on the page. And then in here, I can say, we're just going to call this our target, right? So what we've done is we've got some piece of the template, some target on the template. And then I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to grab Angular's view child. And I'm going to go ahead and go back to my, oops, that's actually the wrong thing. Sorry. Move that down here. And so I'm going to add this view child decorator here. We're going to put the name of that ref. So that's, again, this is mapping to this. We're going to call that target. Why are you complaining? Any type. I'll call it any for the moment. And then the other thing that I actually want to bring in is the view container ref. And I will explain the view container ref in just a second here. And so the way to read this is what I'm saying to Angular is I want you to, when this view is instantiated, query for, right, select this part of the template that I've asked for, this target here, and then give me the view container ref. And so the view container ref is just basically the space in which this thing exists. So if we were to look at this template, I'm going to wrap this in a div to make it a little bit easier to kind of visualize. So what I'm asking for is the view container ref. And the view container ref is basically the space within this div, right? So it's not the space here. Like this is not the view container ref in here, right? The view container ref is the space in which this thing exists. And this is why, if you've ever sort of looked at your router when you were doing routing in Angular 2, this is why your component does not end up inside of the router outlet. It ends up next to the router outlet. Does that make sense? So it's not that I'm going to put this thing in here. It's that I'm saying I am defining the space that I want this component to be inserted into. So the two parts, again, here, right? I need the factory, which the component factory resolver will give to me. And then I need somewhere to put it, the container that I want to insert this thing into, right? And so what we'll do is we'll actually pull this out of here. That's a private. This. So what I want to do is like ng after view init. And there's a couple of different places you can do this in the lifecycle. I'm going to do it here. What we can say then is this dot target. And I'm going to change that now to a view container ref because I've imported it. So this dot target dot create component. And what I pass into this is my resolved component factory. So I'm going to take this factory, which I've asked Angular's compiler for, and I'm going to stick it into there. And so the theory here, hopefully, is that, OK, Angular's going to fire this component up. It's going to actually go ahead and instantiate my app component. It's going to query for this little target here. Once that target is found, then we're going to grab our factory, and we're going to go ahead and insert it into that space there. That make sense? See if I'm actually going to lie to you and see if this actually works now. Come out of DevTools. Oh my God, it worked. All this the first time is a little scary. So the key here is, and let's just inspect this little bit of DOM here, just so you can kind of visualize this component ref here. So this is that div, remember, that I defined. Oops. So this is that kind of wrapper div, right? And you can see then it's inserted my dynamic component into this container ref space here. So just to flip between that again. So again, this div here is this div here. That template, right? That's where our little template target was. It's been removed from the DOM because there's nothing in it. It's inert. And then we've inserted our dynamic component into that space there. Make sense? So if you're lazy like me, you go, but Rob, why do I have to every time go ahead and do this entry components thing? And if you've noticed, when you do this with Angular's router, you don't have to define entry components, right? It's not something that you actually have to explicitly say. We sort of figure that out for you. And it's not something that's magical. It's not something that's special to the router. And this is a pattern that you can totally implement for yourself. So let's do this properly this time. I'm going to go ahead and create like a new, let's call it my other dot module. I'm just going to stop typing. We're going to import from here the ng module, Angular core. I'm going to export my other module from here. And so you've maybe seen this when you've been doing the routers. You can do this neat little special syntax here. So I can say something like static with components, pass in an array of components, plus it any. Should really turn that off before giving talks. And then we've got this magical special token, which nobody knows about, but everybody should use. And it's called analyze for entry components here. So write this down because this is an important little component that you should remember. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to return from here an ng module. And that's going to be my other module. I'm going to return a list of providers with that. And what I'm going to say is provide analyze for entry components. We're going to say use value components, and it's multi-true. So what it means is when I want to use this, I can go back to my main app. And so imagine you're creating like a reusable dialog service or a reusable modal service or anything that you're going to reuse as a service that's going to do dynamic component insertion, right? So I can go ahead and bring in imports from ./my.other.module. That in. And now when I do this import, I can do the same thing that we do with the router, right? I can say my other module dot with components and pass in my dynamic component here. I'll do this as an array. We can take out our entry components box here. So again, like the net isn't that different, right? But it's something, it's one less level of overhead to think about. So if you're on a team who's building, again, reusable stuff to be shared with other teams in your company, for example, defining these things as modules, these little static APIs that you can use, becomes a really nice, portable, easy pattern to do this kind of stuff. So this is sort of the way that I would recommend if you're going to build a dialog or a modal or any service like that, right? Have the service, have the module that encapsulates that stuff, and then give yourself this extra little hook that you can use to actually deal with all the compilation stuff. This works exactly the same in JIT or AOT mode, right? So again, it's not something you have to think about once you've implemented it. Does that make sense to everybody? Any specific questions you want to ask on that? Totally. I did that good. Yes. So that's a good question. So if we go back and look at our app component. So this .target.create component, this returns a component ref. And so that component ref now is the reference to the dynamic component, or the wrapper around the dynamic component. So I look at compref.instance. This is now the actual instantiated version of the my dynamic class here. So I could say, you know, imagine I had on here, I don't know, like at inputs, whatever, right? Whatever, if any, of course. In here, then I could say whatever is foo. That makes sense? So it allows you to basically, once you get that component ref, you've got the instance of the thing, and then you can just talk to it as if it was a regular class. One thing to note, if you do this, you do need to deal with change detection manually from here. So I would typically suggest when you're doing these sort of dynamic component things, if you're doing this where you're injecting a whole component into the view, you probably don't want to deal with that thing as inputs and outputs, right? It should probably do DI. It should probably inject the service that it needs. It should probably inject, you know, like the modal instance service or whatever, rather than trying to deal with the inputs and outputs from that component. That make sense? Yes? No? Ish? Yeah? OK. Ask me about it otherwise if it doesn't. So that's kind of that's the like most base, low level, probably the most powerful API in Angular. This is how, again, the router does it. This is how all of our systems do it. This is not something that's private, not something that you cannot use. This is something that you should absolutely use in your own applications if you're building anything that's dynamic at all. And so imagine if you scaled this up a little bit higher, right? And you could do the thing where you actually had a module that had 50 components, and you wanted to assemble a dynamic dashboard from server metadata. Right? People ask me all the time, like, I want to do X if a person's logged in, and if I want to do Y if they're not logged in, right? Or there might be an admin or not. You want to change the view based on this stuff. This is a really good pattern to do it. So this is what I would call it just dynamic component insertion. Again, not private API. It's something you can totally use for yourself. There are other ways to do this. This is, I think, as this is the most powerful one. This is the one that you should understand how it works. A couple of other things just to mention here while we're at this. Pull this out. This create component takes a couple of different things. It takes the actual component factory itself. It takes the index. So it means if I had 3 or 4 elements inside of that container, right? If I had 2 or 3 elements there already, I could give it a specific index to go to, 4 or whatever. We'll do it 0 in this case. The other thing you can do is actually pass in an injector here. So this is what Angular does when you're using the router and you're doing lazy loading of router modules. We're actually passing in the parent injector, and then we're getting a new injector connected to that. So for example, if you wanted to do something like inside of this class, say I wanted to, let's see if I can inject this. So I bring in the injector. Go back to my thing here. So I can actually do something like let new injector is this dot injector dot. It's not what I want, is it? I want injector dot. Oh, sorry. It's reflective injector. The reflective injector. Again, this is an API that you probably won't end up using, but I just want you to see it so you can understand how sort of DI gets fixed with this. So for example, I can do from resolved providers here. I can do, this is all regular injector stuff, and I can do resolve and create. And in here, I can pass in, just regular DI bindings. Provide foo, use value bar. And this will give me another injector, and then I can actually take this injector and pass it in to this thing. So that means that inside of this new instantiated component, right, if this component asks for foo, I can give it a different instance of foo. A pattern where this is really, really useful, if we imagine this was like my dialog component, a pattern that we have seen often used, which I think is pretty good, is you could in here do something like my dialog instance is a my dialog instance. And so this would allow you to, for example, do something like do class my dialog instance. I want to say close. It means that I can inject the specific instance of this dialog for this component and say close on it, right? So it gives you the ability to wire up services from the outside world, specific copies of services from the outside world, specific instances of things, configuration values, all that kind of stuff can be done at this injector API level. So that's probably enough on View Container, View Factory. Any questions on that? Anything? Everybody's kind of like, oh my God, that was too scary. Cool. So let's do a simple one. So that's, as I said, that's like a really super powerful API. It's something that is very, very useful. And I think it's something that really, once you start messing with that, you really clearly understand the kind of the underlying mechanics of Angular. There are a couple other cool things you can do, though, that don't require quite so much boilerplate. So one of the things that we discovered, we've had this API in here for a while. So like ng-for, ng-if, et cetera, they all work with we call them structural directives. So when you see the syntax that's like star ng-for, that little star is telling Angular, hey, this is some piece of, thank you, this is some piece of DOM that I'm going to stamp out, right? It's some template, some chunk of UI that I want to use repeatedly. If you use the star syntax, one of the things that's neat is that Angular will not actually instantiate the stuff that's within here. So if I do ng-if, right, foo, Angular's not going to instantiate whatever I put in here. So if I just said hello, Angular will not instantiate this until this value is true, until this template that's contained in here is actually injected into the view. So it gives you the ability to define pieces of UI, have the Angular's compiler capture them and store them for you, right? And then you can insert them into the view, reuse them, whatever you want to do. So there's a lot of kind of, again, there's a low-level kind of imperative API you can do, but we discovered quite quickly that it was really a lot of boilerplate. So we added a really super neat little syntax here. And I'm going to just do, so again, I'm going to do a template. Templates are highly useful when you're doing this kind of stuff. And inside of here, I'm going to say, hello, actually, let's put this inside of a div just so we don't lose track. All right. So first thing I want to do is, let's imagine that I want to use this multiple places in a view, right? Maybe I'm doing like a UI grid view, right, that has multiple table cells. I want people to be able to define bits of UI without having to define an entire component, right, without having to go through all that rigmarole we were just doing. So what I can do is I can just grab a ref. So I'm going to call this like name tag, right? So again, all this does is say to Angular, this is a variable, right? This is something that I want you to keep track of in the view that I can refer to elsewhere. And then if I were to define some other part of UI here, what I can do is I can use the ng template outlets. And I just give this the ref of the template that I want to use, right? So this is very much like the router outlet, right? It's some container on the page that I want to jam this template into. So again, the theory here would be that what will happen is when Angular's compiler picks this up, it will go, okay, this is a reusable chunk of UI, right? It's going to capture that template ref, and it's basically going to stick it in there. Does that make sense? So let's make sure this is actually running. Of course it's not, because I've done something silly, undefined by the app module. Oh, I deleted that. Get rid of that for the moment, and get rid of that, and get rid of Groovy. Cool. So now there's a couple things to notice here because I screwed that up the first time. So if I would just do name here, and I do Rob, I don't actually know where my browser keeps going. There it is. So this is me using the context from the template, like the outer container. So let's look at that again. This is name coming from here, right? From the class in which I've defined this template. The thing you'll notice is that this isn't immediately useful, right? Because you don't necessarily want to use the same piece of data, let's say, in this template multiple times, right? I might want to stamp out 2 of these name tags and give them 2 different names, right? So this is something that is actually really nice and easy to mess with. So what I'm going to do is say, I'm going to call like my context here. I'm just going to create a regular variable, and this is going to do a couple of things. Inside of here, it's going to have an implicit property, and I'll dive a little bit deeper in the next part of this. And this time, I'm going to say name is Rob, much more excited Rob the second time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, instead of just using this name property directly, I'm going to say let x. And this is the same thing if you've ever written, an ng4, and you do something like ng4 let foo of foos. This is that same let, right? We're just, again, just declaring a variable, just saying this is a variable that I want to reference by name. That. And so now what I can say is do x.name. So again, inside of this container here, x is going to be basically something that I can programmatically control. So x becomes this implicit property here. And then I can say this is x.name. And then what I do is I use and I never remember what this thing is called. I have to look it up in front of you, angular.io. And an hour ago, I ran through this. And I was like, I need to remember the name of this thing. And I forgot what it was called, ng templates outlets. Love it when our docs have the answer that I need. So it's the ng outlet context, if you want to go look this again. What I can do is say the ng outlet context is my context in this case. And so the theory here should be that instead of using the values from the kind of outer container, from this outer class, we're going to implicitly assign that kind of local variable, if you like. So this let x is this implicit. And now what we should see is a much more excited Rob in our thing. And just to preview that this isn't kind of anything nefarious, if I do the same thing again, and do like my context 2, even more excited version of me, it renders twice. So it allows you to take this little piece of DOM, right, capture it, stick it somewhere, and then stamp it out repeatedly, whatever you want, and give it individual bits of data. Does that make sense? Cool. Is it? Yes, it is. It is absolutely using the exact same APIs that Angular is under the hood. So it's the same performance level that anything else Angular is going to be. And again, all the compilations already happened, and that's why we're doing this stuff in the view here, right? So all the compiler stuff happens. This isn't being dynamically compiled. Under the hood, it's a chunk of already ready to go DOM you can just stick into the view. Make sense? Cool. So let's do something a little more interesting than this. Yeah?
What if you were manipulating the style at the same time that it affects the speed?
So depending on the DOM API you use, right? Like if you do things that are going to trigger a reflow or a repaint, then yes, you could certainly do that incorrectly. I think in general, like when you're doing things declaratively this way, right? Angular is going to do this all in kind of a single shot, so it's not something you have to worry about. If you're in the lower level API, so I was doing the create component thing there. In extreme cases, you might want to think about doing things like batching them up or putting them on a request animation frame or anything like that. But in general, no. Using these APIs, they're designed to be very, 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 very fast wherever possible. OK, so I mentioned to you that if we do something like ul, I need to really steal caret snippet setup because she types much faster than I do on these things. So let's do let user of users. So again, the idea here is that the space in between the thing with the star is a chunk of reusable DOM, right? So like user.name, and if we do users is name of Rob, right? It'll render them out. So the key is that this thing is exactly the same as the ng template context we just looked at, right? It's the same underlying low-level mechanics. But it may be that like ng4 or ngIf doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. And it may be that what you're doing is slightly more complicated, is not something you could do declaratively in the view, statically in a template. So that same underlying API that the ng template outlet is using is something that's available for you to use in your own applications as well. And so again, this is how ng4 works, ngIf. All of them are using the same consistent underlying API that you can sort of use for your own purposes. So if you know anything about me and you've watched any of my talks before, like all I talk about all the time is observables and reactive programming, right? So of course, we're going to talk about that today a little bit. So one of the things, if you've done any observable stuff in Angular, is you found that if you do observable of this, you can use the async pipe, right? And the async pipe goes ahead and unwraps this for you. It sort of manages all the observable stuff. You don't have to worry about it, right? It's a very nice, easy to use thing. What you'll find, though, is if you're not doing ng4, right, you're not repeating over something, then you get into this situation where if I wanted to do, instead of an array of these things, if I wanted to use a name, let's say, just like a plain object, I want to say name Rob in here. You get in this case where, OK, this thing is asynchronous. Let's get rid of our list. And so you end up doing this. You end up doing something like users. I'll change that to user. User.name would be your initial thought, right? I'll just do it this way, except that because this value is going to be asynchronously delivered, right? User may not be defined right now. So that means your view is going to explode. You look at the error message. This is one of those things that when you come to Angular 2 the first time, you go kind of, what, right? So the syntax that really not many people know that you can use for this is pretty ugly, I think. So you can do something like this. You can do user async. You can wrap that in parentheses. And then you can do the Elvis operator, the safe null navigation operator, whatever it's called, and do name. So this is technically the correct syntax to do something like this. But of course, if you have more than one property, right, so like age 33, you end up doing this again and again and again. The other thing that's really important to note here is because this is an observable, each time I use the async pipe here, I'm invoking a new subscription of the observable. In this case, it's not a big deal, right? Because it's just like a static thing that emits a value. But if this was an HTTP request, right, something that was going to talk to your backend server, basically each of these asyncs gives you a subscription, and thus each of those asyncs actually gives you a new HTTP request to the backend, right? So there are ways around that. You can do stuff like .share or .publish or whatever. But I think that whatever you're doing, right, this gets tiresome. And I think it's something that's not easy to read when you look and compare it to Angular 1 versus Angular 2, right? You go like, this isn't as nice. This isn't an API as nice. So actually, I was sitting around yesterday. I was trying to avoid watching the election. So I was like, I'm going to tinker with this, right? I'm going to see, like, is there a better way to do this? And is it something that I can actually do without having to, talk to the core team and say, can you build me this thing that I want, right? Can you spend engineering time on that? And so I messed with it a little bit. And I think that what I want to build is how do you solve this problem in your own application, right? Like, how do you use the stuff we've just talked about to do your own version of this? And this is something that I think when I got this working last night, I was like, wow, this is way better than what I was doing before. And I think that if you get a handle on what we're about to do here, then everything you do in Angular 2 will become much, much easier to do. Much, I don't know, it's become something like when you speak this little bit of low-level language we're going to do here, everything becomes very fluent. Everything becomes easy to compose. You can start thinking about views without worrying too much about how Angular works. So what I want to do is define something like this. So we're going to make up a thing. And I'm going to call this like Rx context. And I'm going to say this is a user. So the idea of this is I want to say inside of this container, right? So again, this little star syntax is dealing with this space that's in here, right? This little bit of space here. And what I want to do is write a directive that will allow me to, inside of this space, not worry about Rx, not worry about asynchronicity, not worrying about observables, anything like that, right? And so ideally what I want to be able to do is in here just say, user.name, right? Without worrying about Elvis operators and async pipes and all these sorts of things. And the basic theory here is that, right, rather than writing async at all, if I'm the kind of person who's doing reactive programming, I'm doing things with observables, right, that's the way I'm always going to be writing code, probably. And so it means that I don't want to have to use the async pipe 800 times and worry about multiple descriptions and cleanup and all of this stuff, right? So we're going to add a really clever directive to handle this. We're going to build it from scratch. So first thing we're going to do is go ahead and create a directive. It's going to have a selector. And that selector is going to be this Rx context. And so notice that I'm putting this thing in square braces here, right? So this is an attribute directive. It's not a component itself. There's no template here. This is just going to manage this little chunk of UI. I'm going to say export class Rx context. Go back to my module, bring that in. Add that to our declarations array. And so at this point now, we've created this simple little directory, we've brought it in, and what we should see, I think, is going to be a big explosion. Go like this. Cool. So this is expected, hooray. And there's a couple of things here. So it's going to give me some warnings like Rx context, since it's not a known property of a div. What? OK. So it calls to Rx context here. And then what I want to do, save this for a start.
The order.
Order shouldn't matter on my declarations. Rx context. Actually, make sure I'm looking at the right browser window here. Context, great, cool. So this is actually the error message that I wanted to get. So what we're saying here is we've got our Rx context. And now what we need to think about is, OK, we've got this little piece of UI, this template inside of our space here, right? So again, I'm going to wrap this in an H2 or H1. Just so we can kind of reason about this, right? So again, like what I care about here is this chunk of UI. This is a template. It's a template ref, we call it in Angular. And what this error message is telling me, if you ever see it, is saying like, hey, you're using this Rx context thing, but there's no template. You're not doing anything with it, right? So I don't really know how to handle this scenario. So all we have to do is go into our constructor and say, bring me in the template ref. And because Angular is instantiating this, right, when it creates this thing, actually it can pass it to me straight away. I don't have to query for it like I was doing in the previous example, right? I just get it injected into my container here. Template ref. Go ahead and make this private. Rx context is not a known property of div. Template ref. Why are you complaining? Cool. So let's go back to the actual usage of this. So the interesting thing here is that if you deal with an observable, right, and so this is an observable that's just going to deliver us one value, but this thing might deliver to us multiple values over time, right? It might deliver to us the first state, and then you might go make a server call and update state again. The point is that this thing is going to change over time, right? It's a variable that's going to change. And in this space here, user is actually an observable, right? And the observable is not really what we want, right? We want the value out of the observable. We want the unwrapped data, okay? So this is something that you can do for yourself. And Alex Rickobob pointed this out to me the other day, and it sort of blew my mind that you can really do whatever you want with this little bit of magic. So again, if you're doing an NG4, right, you do let user of whatever users. This syntax is not anything special. It's not anything that Angular really understands. It just knows how to break this string down into little tiny pieces. So I'm going to do something slightly different here. I'm going to rename this to user stream, just so we're clear that this is the observable that we're dealing with, right? And what I'm going to say is let user of user stream, but I'm going to change of to on. And so again, this is just a convention. This is something I made up. I like this because you think about it as events, right? Each time I get a new user object down the stream, use it, right? And so it means that, like in our previous example with letX, right, and like ng4 or whatever, basically now this let user I can use basically as my value inside of this area, right? So this is what it will look like when you're using it. And I think this is a really just generally a nice syntax to think about, right? Like you don't have to think too much about asynchronicity here. All you're saying is each time I get a new user down the pipe, this is what I want to make my little bit of UI. Make sense so far to everybody? Cool. So we'll expand the syntax out a little bit here, Rx context on. And so this is going to let Angular pick up both of the two pieces of this. And I'm going to go ahead and define a couple of inputs. And I'm just going to show you as I look at this, ng4. If this is something that interests you at all, I highly suggest you read through the ng4 implementation. If you've ever looked at ng-repeat in Angular 1, and I think everybody at this table has probably done that at one time, it's like 500 lines of terrifying code that make absolutely no sense to anybody, right? Like it's a Google interview question style kind of block of code, right? And I got asked that question. I was like, I have no idea what it is. And they told me, that's ng-repeat. And I was like, oh, great. So that's why I didn't pass my first interview at Google for ng-repeat. So the thing to look at, though, is that the actual implementation of ng4 in Angular 2 is like 140 lines, not even that, 100 lines of code. It's not a big, scary thing. And it's more or less exactly what you're already writing inside of your own components, right? So we've got lifecycle hooks like ng changes and ng do check. And oops, go back a bit. This is not a scary thing. And this is every time I do this talk, every time I do this little demo that I'm going to do, I pull this up and kind of run along in parallel because 90% of what I'm going to build my own little custom directive here is exactly what's happening inside of ng4. So if you ever get lost, you don't understand what I'm doing here, this is something you want to do on your own, like go read the ng4 source because I think it's a very, very understandable piece of code. So I'm looking at the top of the directive here, right? So again, just like I'm doing, I've got a selector here with these two items. And so just to read this out to you, again, this is Rx context, which is this thing. And then the on here is Rx context on. So you can read this almost like this, right? So it's let the variable, the separator, the delimiter, I guess would be the word you would use here, is what we're attaching here. And then there are two things that get sent into this. Oops. Why not clicking around? This thing has two inputs, right? It's two things that we care about. And if you've ng4, right, you get ng4 of, that's the data you're iterating over, the array that you're passing into your ng4 loop. And then if you've done ng4 track by, right, that's the additional argument you can add to do things, you know, tracking by ID, tracking by identity, whatever. But they're just inputs, right? They're not anything special. It's not magical. The point I want to get across here is that this syntax is not special to Angular. ng4 isn't special. There's nothing inside of Angular or common at all that's special. And it's just a question of kind of like wrapping your brain around how this string gets parsed into its component pieces. So again, Rx context on. I'm going to bring my input here. And in here, I'm going to do my add input, which is the Rx context on. And we want this to be an observable of any. And so again, the idea here is that this value, this user stream, this is an observable here. This is the thing that's going to get assigned to my Rx context on. So rather than unwrapping the observable outside of Angular, we're going to unwrap it inside of our component. So it means that rather than doing the async pipe here, right, we're going to let our directive handle that. Because again, I'm just going to be doing everything reactively in my views, right? So I shouldn't have to make async a special case. I assume that everything here is going to be observable. So I want to pass that observable through. And so what we want to do is ng on inits. What I want to do is log out this Rx context on. Cool. So you can see the directive is kicked up, right? It's spooled up. It exists. It's in the DOM. I've gotten my observable passed through to it, right? So I've got that observable now, and now I can just do regular observable things with it. Inside of here, what I'm going to say is this.rx context on subscribe. And so now it's going to run through, right? And instead of just getting the observable through, I subscribe to the observable, and each time that data changes, right, it's going to pass me a new value through. So now we're almost at the point we were doing when we were using the ng context outlet, right? Like we've got some context, some bit of data that we care about here. And now what we want to do is insert this thing into the view, right? Like we want to stick the new state into the view with this new, we're going to stick that template into the view with the state that we care about. And when we get new state, we're going to update that template, right? I'm going to go back and look at the ng4 docs again, because otherwise I'm going to fumble around here for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to do this again. Let's get rid of that. And see how many times I've been there, because it's in my browser history. Cool. So let's pull this up and have a look. So again, the first thing here is that I'm injecting, or ng4 injects that template ref, right? So that's that thing that we're injecting in our own thing. And then basically what happens is when changes come in from the outside world, Angular does a check, and then we do this apply changes thing. And this is really like the complex bit of ng4, right? So this is doing, gets a new list, gets an old list, diffs them, right? And then says, okay, these are new, these are changed, these are removed, and then goes ahead and inserts and removes the view elements, right? But we're not going to do all this business because we're doing a really simple thing. We've just got a single view that's inserting one thing in, right? So it's not something we have to worry about too much. So going back to our view container idea, what I'm going to do is go ahead and grab my view container ref for this component, VCR. And so again, I'm injecting the container ref. So again, that's this sort of space in the view here. And what I can say is, oops, this dot VCR dot create component. Again, there's that same API. We're going to use the create embedded view API. The difference here is that create component takes a component factory, right? That thing that we create with entry components. Create embedded view, this template that we've stamped out, or we're going to stamp out, this thing, right? It's not a component. It's just a chunk of UI, right? It's not a whole component, so we're not going to create the whole component. We're just going to create an embedded view. That takes a few properties. You can see it takes a template ref, which is the thing that we're, again, getting from the outside world here. So this is our template ref. Don't remember what the rest of these properties are. It takes a context, which is the data that we want to pass into it, right? And an index. Again, we can put it in some specific point in the view. So in this case, the context here is our v, right? It's our state that's coming in from the outside observable. So I'm going to just change this to state, just to be clear about this. And again, we're going to do that same implicit syntax, right? It's not magic. It's that same thing that we've been covering already. And so now, what we're saying here is we're going to subscribe to state. When we get the state, go ahead and create the embedded view, right? Use the template ref, and then pass in some context, some data to this thing. And if we go back and look at this, again, just to map this out for you, let user here is assigning this to a local variable. And then when we're inside of this directive doing our stuff, this implicit here becomes this user, right? These things link up. So now you can see kind of where these two things could go together. With any luck, this isn't going to explode in my face, but let's see. I keep putting in my dev tools and then having to back out of them. There we go. Cool. I don't remember to put in that template. What did I put in that template? User.name. Cool. Wait for that to refresh. Cool. So again, all we've done here is basically done a structural directive, this thing is called, and then really we can do whatever we want. So in this case, now I've got a totally synchronous variable that's ready to go in here. The template's not going to be created until the first bit of data actually arrives, right? So this means you don't have to worry about doing like an ng-if async or having to do the Elvis operator, right? Until the data arrives, the thing's not going to be rendered. If you're paying attention here, this is actually totally wrong because each time we get new state, right, it's going to create a new component, which is probably not what we want to have happen here. So we can just be a little bit smarter about this and do something like, we'll say, view ref, just call this any for the moment. So we'll just do a quick check, right? Like if there isn't a view ref, we'll just create it here. If there isn't a view ref, go ahead and create it. So that we only create it once, right? And then we can do this dot view ref dot, I should actually type that so I don't have to remember this. This is I think it's a view ref. Matthias, do you remember that API offhand? What's the return from a create embedded view? It's a embedded view ref, obviously. Use your TypeScripts. Okay. So we're going to say this dot view ref is actually an embedded view ref, if any. Yep. This dot view ref dot context dot implicit is our state. So this now works in both cases, right? As new state is delivered to the UI, then it will go ahead and update that without making a big mess. Did I what? Implicit. Thank you. And just to prove to you, hopefully, that this works, let's go back to our app component here. And we'll do something like concat observable.delay timer. Let's wait a second and then map to name of Jeff, whose age is 50. Cool. So that's what, like 20 lines of code, if that, 5 through 22, 17, 18 lines of code. And now you've basically got an entirely custom, entirely data-driven, entirely kind of your custom thing using the exact same primitive APIs that Angular uses. You can take this one step further if you're doing things that are really high performant. You asked the performance question, right? Like, what if I'm doing stuff that's really, really high performance? Or like, imagine you do this and you've got a gauge that's going to update, 60 frames per second, whatever. You can do clever stuff here. So I can actually go in here and I can say to the change detector ref, basically, it's eject my private CDR. And so, for example, I could actually go in here and I could detach this little chunk of UI. So this .cdr.detach. And so this would remove this chunk of UI from Angular's change detection cycle. So I don't want to deal with that. But again, because we're using an observable here, I know when I have new data, right? Like it's informing me that I've got new data. I don't have to dirty check against that. So I'm going to detach it when it's created. And then inside of my little bit of loop here, I can say this dot change detector ref dot detect changes. And so this will actually do the UI update programmatically here. So it's going to update only the children. It's not going to run a whole nother change detection cycle across the entire application. I've now got like a very, very tightly scoped little piece of UI that I have total control over the change detection cycle on. Right? So I've broken that now. This, I think, is probably the most exciting thing to me about Angular 2 in general, right? It took a long time to get stable. It took, we had a bunch of RCs, and we're really grateful everybody stuck with us, right? And we made these changes. But a lot of those changes near the end were so that we could get these APIs to be exactly right. And I think we're pretty happy where these are now. And what I want to get across to you is that this is the kind of thing that if you're doing any serious development with Angular 2, you should understand, because this lets you build your own abstractions, right? The Angular team is never going to build for you every single widget directive, little special utility you need. But what we've given you, I think, in 2 is a much, much deeper kind of hook into Angular's core internals, right? This is much more powerful than $compile is, I think. It's much more powerful. It's much more performant than $compile is for a start. All the offline stuff works with this. Like, there's nothing here that's not going to work in an AOT compiled application. These are totally public APIs, and I think that they give you some really, really incredible power. Cool. So that's probably enough talking for me about directives and view container refs and component factory resolvers and resolving components. So if anyone has any questions, this would be a good time to do it. Jeff Cross, of course you have questions. I will absolutely post this on GitHub. And I was actually talking to Mishko today, and I showed him this, and he went, that's really interesting. So this might be something we actually add into the core for you. But you can build your own. Yes? So Angular's change detection in Angular 2, anytime you click an event, you click a button or a promise resolves or whatever, what happens is it goes to the top of your component tree, right? It goes to the root component, and it does a change detection run. So it walks down, and for each component in your tree of application components, it detects changes, right? It says, has any data for this thing changed? Calling detach takes this bit of UI and disconnects it from that cycle. So it means that when change detection runs, bindings inside of this thing are not going to be updated, right? So it just means don't dirty check this thing basically until I programmatically here tell you to actually dirty check this thing. So again, not something you probably need to do, in your sort of regular UI code, but when you're doing things that are high performance, when you're doing things that are doing a lot of rendering, when you're doing things that might have 50,000 table rows, right? That's when you want to be able to understand and really control change detection for a specific part of the UI. I don't believe so. I don't think there's any control over the change detector in 1.5. Matthias, shaking your head? Nope, no way to do it. And that's one of these big things when we redesigned the change detection algorithm in 2. The thing about Angular 2's change detection is it runs once top to bottom, right? That's it. And if you're done in 1.5, you've probably gotten the error message is something like, was it infinite digest, 10 iterations resolved, basically? And that's because Angular's change detection in Angular 1 kind of repeatedly checks, right, to see, okay, this thing has changed, this thing has changed. So it's a big design decision, and that whole sort of top to bottom one-way data flow is what allows us to do kind of programmatic control of these things. Questions, anybody else? Surely you have questions after this thing. No? All right. Yes? So I think that ng template context is absolutely, I think it's documented, not very well, but it is documented. The rest of these are generally, they're things that are actually kind of difficult to document. And so the best suggestion, and then we have a team who's working on sort of dynamic view insertion right now. I believe, let's just go check the docs. I think we added a back advanced. If it's not in yet, maybe it hasn't merged yet. I reviewed a PR yesterday that kind of gives there's a cookbook for the basics of what I've just described to you. Honestly, though, the best thing is, and this is exactly how I learned how to do this, go read the source code for ng4, ngIf, and ng-switch, because they do kind of the 3 things that we've done here. And the other thing to look at is the router source code. The router, I think, is really, really well written, third time. And it's really easy to understand. It's really easy to kind of get a follow how data flows through things, how modules come in, how things get inserted into the view. So really reading the source code in these cases is the best case. And honestly, like that's the thing that's going to be the most up to date. And that's going to be the thing that isn't like a contrived use case example, right? Like it's a real world case. ng4 is what everybody uses. So it's highly tuned and highly optimized. Cool. And I should say that if this is something that you figure out and you're like, this is amazing, and you want to document it, right? You think that it could be better documented, please reach out, send us a PR, send me a tweet or whatever, and I'm quite happy to plug you in with the right people if this is something you really want to engage in and help make the docs better for everybody. Anybody else? Questions? Not on this? OK. So I think we've got some time left, probably, Jeff, Matthias? I don't know. I'm not running this time. I'll just check and see when the shuttle leaves. But I'm at this point, like I'm happy to, and there's 2 or 3 of us here from the core team. If you've got questions on your own stuff you want to talk about, ask them. If you've got questions that are sort of globally useful, I will come back to you in just a second. If you've got questions that are globally useful, right, then that would be a good time to ask them so other people can benefit from them. If you've got your own little like kind of special weird edge case in your own app, maybe let's talk about that after the group discussion. Let's just see. Christina, when's the shuttle leaving? Now? That's why we're asking. So if you're on the shuttle, now would be a good time to leave. Otherwise, yeah, cool.
I have an unrelated question.
Shoot.
What's the extension you have to like jump through documentation?
What do you mean?
Do you have like when you hover over?
Oh, that's a good question. This is new, actually. This is called source graph, I think. Like the one question that I can't answer for you. Let's see. Source graph, yeah. I'd forgotten it was there, and I was like, why am I jumping around? And it's source graph. I think it has the ability to like turn on a slightly nicer view as well. We haven't turned that on, but it's a really useful thing for poking around at GitHub. Anybody else? Questions? Yes, you might as well. Shoot. Sure, yeah.
How do you change observable? How would you achieve it? What is the recommended way to achieve it?
Good question. So how do we chain observables? Yes, I get to talk about observables. So observables are, there's like 75 ways you can chain them. This is kind of the short answer to this, but the important bits are this. So let observable equals new, let's do observable. So I'm just going to start with a basic observable that is an interval. So it's kind of like every second, it's just going to tick out a number for me. Okay. So the short answer here is like, it depends what you want to do. So with a promise, right, if this was some promise dot then v, right, I can return another promise or value from here and resolve with a new promise. Observables are a little more flexible. So it really kind of depends what you want to do. So for example, if I started with an observable of numbers, which is what this is, and I wanted to take each number and make it more exciting, right? So like number, and we can do number plus some exclamation points, right? That's a synchronous transform, right? That's not something that has to go out to the server. There's no delay here. This is not observable. This is a simple transform. It's a map. It's synchronous. So this is the first way to do it, right? I just want to take a value. I have an observable. It's going to spit out a value, and I change that into some other new value. Map is the first one. The most important thing, the magical thing in Rx and observable is flat map. And you'll hear flat map discussed a lot. And flat map is by far the most powerful and most important thing to understand. Okay.
So in promises, we have them and we can pass the callback. I wasn't able to achieve something similar.
So the short answer, the simple version of this, right? So again, any observable is any observable. So I'm going to use the number thing for the same idea, right? So observables have 3 when you subscribe. That's the first thing. So the first parameter is the value, right? So this is the next, we call that. Console.log v. The second is the error handler, right? So this is the error event, console.error. And then the last one is complete. So this doesn't actually emit anything. It just tells you, hey, we're done. Right, so at the simplest, like this is the same, doesn't like that very much. This is the same as the end of a promise chain. Would you agree with that? This is the sort of same basic, same basic API I'd use in a promise, right? Except there's one extra parameter, and that's completion, okay? So this is error handling at its most basic level. What most people really want to do, though, is do things like this. And this is where I think that the power of observable comes through over the power of promise, right? So let's say you have an HTTP request with a promise. And the thing that happens relatively often, especially on a mobile device, right, is that you're going to send out a request and your server is going to be down or your network's going to be temporarily down, right? With a promise, you deal with it. You actually get a reference to the promise. You like let requests is this. And the problem is like once that request goes out from the promise, that promise is created, it does its work, it's dead, it's done, it can't be reinstantiated, right? So in promise land, you'd have to create a new promise, you'd have to keep a reference to the original request, right? There's a lot of kind of shenanigans to deal with while you're doing that. With an observable, because this idea is kind of baked in, it's just as simple as doing something like retry one, okay? To answer the chaining question, if I wanted to, let's get the first request and then go get a second request based on that, that's where flat map comes in. So if this is going to give me a value, what I can return from flat map is anything that's observable. So I could just say like return observable dot of v plus 1 here, right? And then this is basically promise chaining is what we're doing here. You could change this to then and it would be almost exactly the same. But what's interesting is that a promise, right, will only return one value. This could return many values. So if I wanted to, for each number that comes down the pipe, I actually want to send out v plus 1 and v plus 2. It will not only return the first value and the second value, it will clean up and unsubscribe and all that. So flat map is probably the closest thing to then that you're used to. But when you start composing them, this is the way to do it. Flat map is almost always the thing. The secondary is switch map, which is just a little more advanced than flat map. And all it does is cancel the previous request if there's one in flight. Uses an autocompletes all the time. But flat map is probably the thing that you want. So to your question of like, okay, but what about like interceptors, right? Like what if I want to, for every single thing, transform the response? Uh-huh.
What if the first request fails? I don't have a error handler in the box.
Right?
What do I do?
So it depends. Like that's short answer is it depends. You put your error handler at the end here, it will propagate down to the end just like a promise does, right? So it will drop itself all the way down here. The question you should ask yourself is, how do I want to recover from this failure? Can I recover from this failure, right? If I can, then I would put in something like catch. So catch would let you do, okay, I get the error and I get the original request. And so I can say like here, I want to return observable of, I don't know, or oops. Right, so I can return an observable and recover from that situation, right? Which means that this error handler is not actually going to be called. I'm going to return a different value because it failed, or like my network is down, so I want to hit the cache instead, right? It's a good case for this kind of thing where, okay, it's not a failure, it's something I want to recover from. So if it's something you recover from, use catch. I can do in here like if whatever, then actually go ahead and throw the error in that case, right? So there's a bunch of different ways you can handle it in there. There are cases like this. So to the question of like when, I want to fail in one case, but I want to retry in another case, you can do things like retry when, which will wait for n seconds or till another observable comes out or till your authentication request from your server comes back out, whatever. You can recover with a retry when. Otherwise, you always just catch it down in your subscribe block. The big difference you'll find is that observables are designed to be a little more explodey than promises. Promises will often swallow errors for you, which is nice in a real-world application, right? But it's not super useful when you're developing because you swallow these errors and things kind of disappear into the ether. That's an accepted behavior of promises, and that's the way promises work. RX is designed so that it throws these errors at you early. It forces you to handle your errors. So if you don't have an error handler in here, you will see a big scary red message that says like this is an uncaught exception and your program will stop. So it's always about like, how do I want to recover from the error? Not just there is an error or not. That's kind of promises it failed or it didn't. Observables say it failed, here's why, and what do you want to do about it, right? To your question of interceptors, does that answer the first question well enough? Yeah. So to the question of interceptors, this is something that Jeff and I have discussed for a long time. This is really Jeff's fault. If you want to blame anybody, it's Jeff's fault. He made the decision long before I joined the team. But we had this basic problem. And again, I've done a lot of Angular 1 code. I was an Angular 1 consultant for a long time. And pretty much everybody who uses interceptors in Angular 1 at some point ends up with a gigantic like if-else block or a switch statement because nobody is really talking to one API only in a single application, right? The problem with interceptors and transformers is they are global to your entire application, right? There's something that it applies to the entire application, and you end up with all this crazy logic on the inside. So I think when we built HTTP the first time, we decided that was not a pattern we really wanted to go with because it was a really bad anti-pattern. And again, because we have all this observable stuff, composition's relatively straightforward to do. So again, if we imagine this is an HTTP request coming back, right? We can do map and just do a simple transform, right? It's easy enough to just say like, extract users or whatever from that. The other thing is that you can compose this into slightly larger pieces. So if I imagine I want to build my function response transformer, so we're going to like almost do the exact thing we do in Angular 1 here. We can say that this takes an input, which is an observable of, we'll just say any for the moment. And in here, we can do something like, inputs dot map v dot data, for example, right? This is a pretty common thing you see in Angular 1 applications. So now I have this reusable bit of stream, right? It's got an input that's a stream. It's going to return a new observable or an observable in, observable out. And now I have this reusable chunk of code that I can just do observable.let response transformer and subscribe to that. Right? So I've taken this interceptor and I've kind of bundled it up into a vanilla function. This function is super easy to test, right? There's no DI involved here. There's no global state. There's no global registry or anything like that, right? It's just a reusable function. And so I think that in general for HTTP, we feel like composition is generally the better answer to this question. I think there's some cases where we've decided that, okay, there are things that we can tweak in the HTTP API to make it a little bit easier to do things like overrides, to make it do things like request transformers. Anything you want to say about HTTP while I'm babbling about it?
One thing is the one we saw a lot of applications injecting the HTTP directly into the direct components. encapsulating the patterns by kind of taking the right headers, parameters, and transformations.
It's for your own good.
And
So
we do have a big discussion issue, which I haven't seen if it's not adding these things, but because having compelling use cases for why. You probably remember the issue number.
Not offhand. It sits on Angular core though.
But if you do have
And so when we talk about composition, right? So just to show everybody, the kind of thing that we suggest doing, and everybody's like, oh, but that's like it's a lot of extra work. It's 4 methods, right? That you should implement when you're doing HTTP. It's not a huge thing. We would definitely suggest not extending HTTP. We see a lot of that, like people define an HTTP base class and they extend it. Don't do that, right? So this is DI composition. This is really good at. So I'm gonna have a my API service that injects HTTP in here, right? And then it's very simple to do something like this.http .gets URL options, right? And then in here, I could do my let's response transformer. Response transformer. Or, if I wanted to do like a request transformer, request interceptor, that's as simple as doing return observable .of my URL and options. And again, I'm just going to map it, right? Like this is the request object now. And I can do whatever in here. And then I can flat map that request, this.http.get request. Right, so it's not something that like we have to provide as a core API because it's very, very straightforward to use Rx and composition to really just compose this thing. And now this service, this my API service, is really testable, right? Because then you just put in a mock version of HTTP. It makes it really, really easy to test, really, really easy to reuse. You can provide a different implementation of HTTP, right? This is kind of composition 101 for Angular. And this is generally what we'd recommend over doing like my API extends HTTP, because then you have to deal with constructors and supers and DI, and it's not a very nice way of doing things. So in general, composition and Rx composition is the right way to handle that. And definitely, like, if you've got feedback on it, I think that we'd love to hear more input on the issue, because we're starting to think about this problem again. One of the things that I've sort of thought about, and I'm going to surprise Jeff by saying this, right? But one of the things we've considered is doing something like HTTP module with config, for example, right? So to give you the ability to pass in a little bit of configuration here, because we could do this in such a way that you don't end up with a single global instance of HTTP. Angular's DI lets us do that now. So we could have multiple kind of configured versions of HTTP, but I don't think we're ever going to give you like a globally configurable option to do that. I don't think we had, but it's a reasonably good question. I think that actually the Angular, I think it's in the docs, isn't it?
He's working on this.
Oh, is he? So yes, is the answer to that. Cool.
Plus, me,
Mm-hmm.
that is one of the first things that I exposed the issue to. Yeah.
For sure. And I think it's good feedback for us, right? Because these are the kind of things that we can go then sit down with the documentation and say, hey, this question comes up all the time. Maybe we should have a section in the documentation about how do we do X, right? How's this thing that I did in one? Cool. Yeah. Hey. Yes. So I guess you want to specify your kind of exact case in general? Because the short answer to that question is yes. That's probably not an answer to your question. So. Uh-huh. So the first thing is that AOT compilation and lazy loading are not in any way related to each other. They are kind of two distinct processes that happen at different application lifecycle points. So you would generally want to compile the entire application. And the point is that compiling is different than bundling, right? So compiling the application is just letting Angular's compiler run against it. You would typically run that against your entire application. The question then becomes, how do I bundle my application? And that's where lazy loading comes in, right? And so the change that happens is that we're going to generate you a new module, basically. We're going to generate like the factory version of your module. And so Angular's router is actually designed already to switch between these two things. It knows how to handle either the I'm going to dynamically compile this module case, or I'm going to use this already compiled module factory and plug it in. So absolutely yes. And I think that is, for most people, what you should really strive to get to is using both AOT and lazy loading in your application, right? Because you get the best of both. You don't pay for the compiler. That first bundle is small and it's lightning fast, right? And then bundles that you load in later are again smaller and are still instant loading, once they're actually in the browser. So absolutely yes. And if you want me to show you a demo after this, I'm quite happy to kind of walk you through what it looks like to do lazy loading and AOT together. But like our Webpack plugin, CLI, it does all that kind of magically and automatically. It's not something you have to worry about. Cool. Yeah. Uh-huh. So it's hard for me to say do X or Y, right? Like a lot of that's going to come down to business cases and this, that, and the other. But the upgrade module that we've built is designed for exactly that case, right? I have a mega Angular 1 application, right? There's tens of millions of hours into it, right? But I want to use Angular 2 to build a shiny new table view or whatever, right? That's absolutely a case that upgrade is designed to support. The newest version of upgrade, is that coming in 2.2? Do you know, AOT upgrade? I think so. Cool. So one of the features that's going to land in 2.2, hopefully tomorrow, is ahead of time compilation working with lazy loading. So that means that you can run really both frameworks and pay as little cost as possible. So absolutely, you could run an Angular 1 app, start putting Angular 2 components into it, and then over time, the idea would be you would just evolve the entire, your entire application and eventually replace all the pieces from 1 to 2. And you may never do that, and if you don't, then that's absolutely fine, right? And our goal with 2 is to make it absolutely as small as possible after it's been compiled, so that you pay as little cost as possible for for having that extra framework on top. Nope, we have a module called ng upgrade for that exact case, and that's what it's designed for. So yeah. Did everybody see me get in trouble today in Info World when I said Angular 3 and the reporter was like, he said Angular 3, I want to blog about it. So Angular 3 will be around in, I think March is what it's looking like at the moment. I think March, is that right? March, April-ish? It's about 6 months since we released Angular 2.0. And so the key things that everybody freak out in the room, the idea of Angular 3, right, is that Angular 3 is going to be a incremental change. It's not going to be like Angular 1 to Angular 2 ever again. Nobody's ever going to do that again on the Angular team. And the point is that we're going to give you deprecation warnings up front. We're going to say these are the things that are going to break. We're very much borrowing from the React versioning policy, where they give you, this is what's coming in the next breaking change. So you get a fair warning on that, but we will give you a major version to actually go ahead and do breaking changes. So if there are breaking changes in Angular 3, they will be as minor as possible. In general, most of them will be deprecated. You'll start getting a warning in Angular 3 that says, hey, this thing will be removed in Angular 4. This is the upgrade path you should use to use it instead. So yeah, we're never going to do like Angular 1 to Angular 2 again, because I'm going to have to quit the Angular team if we do that. So cool. Yeah.
So the CLI is creating
yes, I think at last count 3 bundles.
right. So
Mm-hmm.
module.
So it really actually depends on the way your application is structured. But typically, I think the out-of-the-box setup with CLI is that it does like a vendor bundle, a polyfills bundle, and like your main bundle. And then what it will do is what Webpack will do is when you have a lazy module, like a thing that's lazy loaded later, it will say, okay, what's already in the common module, right, in this common bundle, and not include that stuff, and only include stuff that's specific to the lazy loaded modules. So like this is something that Webpack was designed to do. So it's all kind of pretty much magical and automatic, and you're not going to have duplicated code or extra code between modules, but you'll end up with basically like at least one extra bundle per lazy route. In certain cases, you'll end up with more because it'll decide, okay, route A and route B have some shared dependencies. Let's put them in another module between them. Yes, you'll always have a bundle for the lazy loaded routes. It just depends kind of how much other code gets included in that bundle, right? So like if you don't use HTTP until you get to lazy route B, HTTP will end up in that lazy route B module. If you use HTTP in lazy route A and lazy route B, right, it'll put it in kind of a shared common model between them. Nope, that's all handled for you. Cool. Other questions?
So if I have a like third-party component,
sure.
look and
So there isn't a best approach is the short answer to that question. Part of this is because, and I should actually sort of fairly answer this question. So let me just do this, my component. So if you have a component like this, right? It's got a selector, foo, right? And it's got a template. The question is, what does inheritance mean in this case, right? So basic object-oriented, TS says like if I have a foo property here as a string, right, and then my class, my super or my sub component extends my component, right? Clearly, overriding the foo property here is going to override the foo property here, right? That makes sense. That's basic class-based stuff, right? But what does it mean to extend a component decorator, right? So for example, if I do @component here, components, do I merge here, right? So like if this is selector bar and this has a different template, right? Should this override? Should things from the subclass be propagated? Do we merge them? Do we overwrite, right? Where do we do this? What if we have, what if they both have an array of like providers? Right? Do we merge the two arrays? Does the second array replace the first array? Right? There's no real defined semantic for this, which is why we are being very, very reticent right now to say this is how you should do class-based extension, right? The right way to do it, and I realize in your case this may not be possible because it's a different team that's doing it, right? But the right way, if you feel like you must do extension of classes, right, is to basically have a defined base class which has the behavior but has none of the Angular metadata on it. So no component decorator, no @input decorator, right? This is where you put the common logic, and then your superclasses or your subclasses could actually then add their own decorators, right? But we don't have a good defined semantic for what does it mean for inheritance and decorators together. It's something we've discussed. And I think that until there's a better answer from the standards community, it's not something that we really want to approach too much, just because we're likely to do it the wrong way, right? And what we don't want to have is tens of thousands of people writing components the wrong way with the inheritance and extensions, right? Which then doesn't match the spec or something changes, right? And we get in trouble. So we're being very, very reticent about doing this at the moment. In general, trying to think about, and I said this earlier, but trying to think about like a template as a distinct thing from the class is not really the right mental model. It's not like Angular 1 where you took a controller and a template and glued them together. The base unit in Angular 2 is very much components, right? And components are the thing that you compose rather than individual templates or components being kind of merged together. That's not to say that if you're, if there's something you really, really want to do, I've seen a couple of teams already doing automation of this, right? Where they have metadata that generates these classes for them, which is a perfectly reasonable thing if you're a big shop, right? But I think for most people, being able to do composition this way works in cases where, for example, you have access to the original code. The other thing that I get told all the time by way better computer scientists than me is that like this opinion sometimes of like don't ever copy anything, like dry, right? can often lead to you getting yourself in really more kind of convoluted code situations than you really need to, right? Like if this other directive this team has does 80% of what you want it to do, right? Just copy it, right? Just copy and paste the code, do what works, and that way you're not worried about if they change their implementation or whatever. Like it's a case, you have to do it sort of case by case. But for me, I don't see like just copy the code and re-implement it as a dirty word, honestly. So thanks for coming, everybody.